getting in
Let
on
me
the
get started.
laptop.
No, I sell real estate, so the phone rings. Unfortunately, it does. So,
Right.
okay.
For sure. You've been
No,
busy.
Greg is talking.
Connected to Stevens Galaxy A715 5G and laptop 70798
Stephen, Sue, I hear you, but we don't see you. I shall let everyone know that the cameras are now rolling for the live stream, or they will be in a second. So we're gonna get started. It's great to be back with everyone. I want to just make mention, as I did a few moments ago, that the temple had a wonderful experience on Saturday at the Palm Beach Pride Festival in Lake Worth Beach. Had actually several people come by this temple saying, "Oh, we're looking for a synagogue that would be warm and welcoming to who we are." It was nice to hear. And Phil, we spoke of your experience a few times. There were a lot of folks who mentioned, and Phil has just walked away, that they have been to another synagogue in the community that is particularly oriented toward the LGBTQ community, and have said, "Yeah, we went, we didn't love it." And I said, "Well, you should talk to Phil because he would tell you why he comes to Boca Raton."
I had a horrendous experience there. I mean, two of them, as a matter of fact, and I never went back. And I had gone. They had a Seder the first year I lived here when I didn't know anyone, and I went to that, and that was okay. But their services, the people were not nice, and I went to sit down, and someone said that seat is taken.
I didn't want to open up a session to denigrate anybody else. That wasn't why I mentioned. That was more about that there are LGBTQ folks in South Florida who are looking for a synagogue, and it's great that we were at the event on Saturday to be the place that they could potentially be welcomed by us.
I'll shut up because I can go on about these subjects.
Right. So we're going to jump right into the learning today. Let me throw up the slides and we can get started. Give me 1 second to make sure this falls the way I want it to. Good. Here we go. You can see dignity, diversity, and community. All right. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to do a brief review of the things that Rabbi Micah taught last week, just because I want to consider our conversation today not a separate conversation from his, but an extension of it. And we're going to focus a lot today on gender and the varieties of gender expressions that our tradition has. I don't want to use the word recognized because that feels too authoritative, but has experienced and has discussed in various texts in our tradition. So jumping right into where we were last week. So this was the first text that Rabbi Micah shared with us last week. It was for this reason that the human was first created as one person, ha-adam in Hebrew, to teach you that anyone who destroys a life is considered by Scripture to have destroyed an entire world. That's a text that we've heard many, many times. We mentioned last week that it's common not just to Judaism, but also to Islam as well, that each one of us is the potential of an entire universe in who we are. Anyone who saves a life is as if they have saved an entire world. That's the inverse of that, obviously. And also to promote peace among the creations, that no person could say to their friend, my ancestors are greater than yours, right? If we are all descendants of the single common ancestor, our ancestry is all equal in the same. I'll just make a note to say that it's a similar text that's often referred to when we talk about other issues of equality, like racial equality, which is that we are all descendants of a single human being. And what's interesting is that when you look at the history of racist thought and racist writings, there was at a time when there was a theory that was pronounced that was that there were two creations, that people of color were descendants of a separate couldn't in violation dafka of this particular text. Obviously, that is not the way our tradition teaches, but couldn't help myself but to mention that as well. So we have this notion that we are all descended from a single human being, a single common ancestor, so that each one of us have the creative and generative possibility of an entire universe, and we are all equally awesome. So high fives to all of us. And also, to express the grandeur of the Holy One of Blessing, for a human strikes many coins from the same die, and all the coins are alike. But the ruler Malech Malchei Hamlachim, the sovereign of sovereigns, the Holy One of blessing, strikes every human from the die of the first human, and no person is quite like their friend. Therefore, every person must say, for my sake, the world was created, right? We take a stamp and we 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 stamp, and it all looks the same from the same stamp. But that's not how God works. God has this magic stamp, that the stamp is of the first human being, and every time God stamps, a new iteration comes out. We are each all unique, and our uniqueness is an expression of our divinity. We are divine because we are unique. We are not divine because we are similar. We are divine because we are similar, and we are divine because we are unique. That was the first teaching from last week. And the second teaching from last week was this reflection from the weekday morning Yotzer. All of them are beloved. All of them are choice or chosen. All of them are mighty. All of them carry out in all the will of their Creator. All of them open their mouth in holiness and purity with song and melody. They bless and praise and glorify and exalt and sanctify and declare the power of the name of the God, the great, the mighty, the awesome ruler. Blessed be God. They all receive the yoke of the kingdom of heaven from one another, and they lovingly bestow upon one another permission, thus sanctifying their Creator with serenity of spirits, with pure and pleasant speech. They all answer holiness to one another, declaring as one in awe, Kadosh, 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 holy, holy, holy is Adonai of hosts. The fullness of the earth is God's glory. A reminder for those who were here last week, a renewed teaching for those of you who were not. This is based on the verses from Isaiah, where we see the angels in heaven who have 3 sets of wings and have 1 leg, and the image or the vision that Isaiah had of the angels declaring God's holiness, Kadosh, 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 back and forth to each other. It's the part of the liturgy that we recite in the Kedusha, that we say in the morning and in the afternoon service. But as we mentioned briefly in the conversation last week, when the rabbis were putting together the liturgy for the morning service, when they were writing the blessings that we say, when they wrote the weekday morning Yotzer, which is where this text comes from, they included a recitation of the Kedusha. Now, it's not done in the same way where we're all standing and we put our feet together, and we bounce up on our toes like we do during the Kedusha. This can be said when you're alone or in a minyan. And the belief is that the rabbis added this to the text so that if you were praying without a minyan in the morning, which a lot of people do, you had the opportunity to at least recite the words of the Kedusha, Kadosh, 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 even if you weren't praying it with a minyan, which ordinarily you would be required to do it during the Amidah, to do it during the Tefillah. Getting a little heady here, I know, for 1 second, but I'm going to bring it back for a second. Why did they do this? What's going on in this text? Well, in Isaiah's vision, the angels are declaring God's holiness back and forth to each other. But in the liturgical piece that we see here, and I think that as Rabbi Micah Buckiel taught last week, while the text emanates out of angels speaking to one another, how are we supposed to interpret who the audience and who the subject of this prayer is? Is it the angels? And is it the angels only? Can you read my mind and answer the question? Natalie, did you raise your hand?
I did raise my hand. Because I don't know if this answers it at all, or maybe raises another question. But when people say all of them, they don't always mean the same thing. I mean, if I say all of us and you say all of us, we might not be talking about the same universe. So
Sure.
that you might think that this is very inclusive, but somebody else might read it in a more exclusive rather than inclusive way.
Yeah, Yeah. Who's the us?
Who's
So
the us?
Natalie, since you raised the question, I think it's a really important question to raise on this text. You get to be the first one to answer it. As you read this text, as you read this prayer, if you were uttering these words, who is the us that you're thinking about?
Well, it starts with them too, so I don't know, maybe it's bigger than my universe. I don't know how to answer it, but when I read it, my sort of instinctive thought was, you know, not everybody's all is the same.
Okay. So I think that your observation is absolutely true, right? Which is that there are plenty of people in our tradition and outside of it who frankly look for opportunities to draw distinctions between them and other people, right? And I can't say how I can't understate the reality of that, especially in a conversation around LGBTQ life, and especially in America today, right? And the notion of certain people looking for opportunity to draw lines and to say, you count and you don't. These rights apply to you, but not to you. Your concerns matter, your concerns don't. What you think is a current concern actually isn't our concern. Um, and without getting well, fine, I'll just go there, right? And the history of who are the people that has applied to has continued to evolve, right? There certainly have been many moments in our history, and we should note that over the past weekend we marked the 40th anniversary of what many consider to be the beginning of the HIV/AIDS crisis and the first cases being found in this country. And we saw throughout the AIDS pandemic in the 80s and the 90s, and even in 2000, even today, that particularly gay men, but really anyone who is gay or lesbian, for some, you don't count. You don't matter. And that while there has been certainly an increased level of from tolerance to acceptance to welcoming to celebrating gay and lesbian folk in our community, we talk about what I would offer to be another line of distinction, the transgender community. We're seeing the same thing, which is now they're saying you don't count, right? The bill that was passed, but the bill that was passed and signed on a week ago on the first day of Pride last week by our governor, saying to transgender girls you can't play sports with other girls, is I think an important example of that. And we've seen, by the way, just as a note, we've seen how the LGBTQ community has evolved, and I think a good example of that is what the pride flag looks like. Right, the pride flag was initially designed with the 6 rainbow colors, but there's now the new iteration that includes colors that represent transgender folk, that represents black and brown folks and indigenous folks, and that evolution. If you see what's gone on in our community in Boynton Beach and in Delray Beach with the revealings of these pride crosswalks, they're including the more colorful expression, which I think is wonderful. But yeah, who going back to Natalie's point, often the opportunity to say I matter and you don't is a very meaningful, if not insipid, expression of power in the community. And then Natalie, you sidestepped my question of who counts to you. It's okay. It's okay. I'll ask someone else to answer that question. But I'll offer mine. Which is to say that I think that, well, I shouldn't say, we know that the text of Isaiah was specifically referring to the angels. Right? The angels are the one who are the characters and the subjects of the text in Isaiah. But I would offer that when the rabbis choose to take that allusion and that illustration from the book of Isaiah and call upon us and prompt us to utter those words and utter all of so the Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh part comes from the book of Isaiah, but the rest of this, Kulam ahuvim, kulam barurim, kulam giborim, kulam osim be'ema be'yira b'rtzon kon. All of the paragraphs that are on this slide here, the rabbis wrote that. They wrote it as a text to surround the biblical citation. I think that they're challenging us to say it's not just the angels, who the angels are talking about in the verses from Isaiah, it's humanity as well. So the angels are talking about humanity, and they're talking about humanity in this way. All of them are beloved. All of them are chosen. All of them are mighty. all of them carry out the awe and the will of the Creator. Now, if I were Natalie, I would say, Rabbi, you're nuts, right? Because here you are in 2021 saying that the rabbis of 2,000 years ago are saying that Isaiah of the exile period of 1,600 years before that was talking about every human being. And we know that our tradition has not always thought of every human being in the same way. It has drawn distinctions, first and foremost between men and women. And then down the line we go. But you know what? I read these texts with my own two eyes. It says all. I think we should understand it as all. And even if the rabbis at the time who wrote it didn't mean it that way, that's what it means to me. And that's what I think that's how I think God wants us to read it as well. Any objection? I didn't think so. Not that I have the monopoly on wisdom, but I think as I see who I'm learning with today, you're here today because you don't want to object to that idea. Let's push forward. So this is a new text for us today. Genesis Rabbah, right, a midrashic interpretation on the book of Genesis. A lot of Genesis Rabbah has to do with, not surprisingly, with the creation, right? How we were created, how we should understand the stories. And you know, I want to remind everybody as we get into this text that the book of Genesis, chapter 1 and chapter 2, have two descriptions of the creation. And in particular, two descriptions of the creation of humanity, which are fundamentally different, which I'll talk about in a second. And one of the goals that the Midrash, and Genesis Rabbah in particular, lay for itself is to reconcile the fundamental difference in these two fundamentally different stories. What do I mean by that? In Genesis chapter 1, we see the creation of humanity as reflected in this, that God creates humanity. Male and female did God create them. I'm not going to get into the conversation around non-binary folk because there's an intellectual and a textual gap there, which is the text of Genesis as written creates a binary. Male and female did God create them. We can talk about that at a different time and place. We're going to when we get into the Mishnah. But this notion in Genesis 1 is that God created humanity at one time, having both genders, or at least creating both genders at the same time. The other story of creation is the story in Genesis chapter 2. And the story in Genesis chapter 2 is the other story that we know of God creating a single human being who was male, right? The male of Adam, that male who walked around lonesome, that male who God put to sleep, and from whom God took aside to fashion an Ezer Kenegdo, a helpmate, to challenge him, that became known as Eve. So we have these two stories. God created humanity in one fell swoop in both genders, and God created man first, and then from him, God created female. How can they both be true? Because they have to both be true, because the Torah is true. That's one of the questions, and that's the operative question that this text from Genesis Rabbah is going to offer an answer to. And of course, in the answer, it gives us more to play with. Anybody want to read? Lorraine, go ahead. But Lorraine, you got to promise to unmute yourself first so we can hear you.
Okay,
Go ahead.
God said, let us make Adam in our image, in our shape. Our Yirmiyah.
Rabbi.
Oh, Rabbi. Rabbi Yirmiyah ben Elazar said, when the Eternal created Adam initially, he was created as both genders. Thus it is it written, male and female did God create them? Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachman said, when the Eternal created Adam initially, God created him with two faces. one on each side. And when God made Chava, God split him along the middle, forming two backs. They challenged him, but it is written, and God took one of his ribs. He said to them, Mitzalosav doesn't mean rib. It means one of his sides, similar to that which is said, and to the Selah of the tent, which is translated the side of the tent.
Okay. So what's going on here? We have the initial verse from Genesis. Let us make Adam, Ha'adam, this human being, in our image, in our shape. And Rabbi Jeremiah ben Elazar says what I said initially, which is that that initial human being was created with both genders. Now, what the rabbis are going to do is they're going to say, see, Genesis 1, the creation of humanity with both genders, or with all genders, doesn't need to be both, it can be all. And the story of Genesis chapter 2, of God splitting this human being into at least into two people with two different genders, that those are iterations of the same story. It's not one or the other, it's both and there's an evolution to our understanding, right? First, we have the creation of the human being. That human being was created, and by the way, there's already a problem in the text because Hebrew language is gendered and English language is gendered, right? So the second statement, Rab Shmuel Bar Nachman says, when the Eternal One created Adam initially, God created him with two faces. Now, if I was copy editing Genesis Rabbah, I would take out my red pen. Anyone want to guess which word in this text, in that sentence, bothers me?
That's
Philip.
along the middle.
Him.
Yes, exactly, him, right? Rabbi Jeremiah says that God creates Ha'adam, this human being, with both genders. Rab Shmuel doesn't question that and then refers to that character as him. It's problematic, right? Hebrew doesn't have a neutered pronoun like German does and like English does. What's the neutered pronoun in English?
They or you.
It.
It.
It, right? God created it with two faces, one on each side. And when God made Chava, that's Eve, by the way, for those of you who don't remember from Hebrew school, Chava is Eve. God split it along the middle. That first human being had two faces facing like a Janus kind of a thing. And then
Right.
God split it down the middle to create two characters, two human beings. And then God got gender conforming and had one be male and one be female. But it doesn't say it took from one of God's ribs, mitzalosav? Yes, but the word selah, which is the word for rib, is actually also the word for side. So we shouldn't think of this, according to Genesis Rabbah, that it was this notion of a whole, complete, singular human being that had 13 ribs that God put to sleep. God removed one of the ribs and fashioned a whole human being and the other gender out of that rib. That story, according to the teaching in Genesis Rabbah, is reductionist because it gives too much of Adamness and the maleness into that second character. That we should understand it to be that God created a single human being that had two fronts, male and female, both genders. And then when it says from the side, what it meant is God split the two sides in half, creating two people, one male, one female.
Rabbi Greg,
Tracy,
I have a
I see
question.
you jumping. I see you jumping out of your chair, Tracy. Go ahead, please.
Why it and not them?
It's a great question. It could be them. It should be them. Yeah, it should be them. Male and female. Did God create them? Yeah, you're right. I was thinking of it as so let me play with it a little bit. I'll tell you why. So the rabbis are doing the same thing we are. I mean, they're playing with how do we understand and how do we use language as precisely as possible, right? And we know that there are moments in the Torah text that there are peculiarities. And we always presume that peculiarity is there to offer some more precision. And so we ask ourselves, what is this Torah teaching us by using this language, right? For example, before we even get to the creation of humanity, God says, let us make them in our image, right? That's earlier in chapter 1. And there's peculiarities there. Why is God speaking in the plural, right? And we see a
But
parallel between the plural language of which God speaks from and the plural language that God describes the creation. And it's only peculiar because more often than not in Torah, God speaks in the singular. Anochi Adonai Elohecha. I am Adonai your God. Right? God often speaks in the singular. Why in this moment did God choose to speak in the plural? Tracy, you wanted to
well,
add something back?
yeah, I just think that we have to rethink the word them, and then it doesn't have to be plural. And when we say it doesn't feel very human. But when you say them in the singular, then it does feel more human.
So I appreciate the notion that them has become a singular pronoun. But I would caution against automatically applying that new understanding of the word them to the texts. And I say that because Hebrew language, the, the flexibilities that we are using, historical flexibilities, the new usages of words. Listen, when I was in elementary school, and Tracy, I'm sure it was the same for you, and even more the same for our more senior partners in this learning today. If we would use the plural, the pronoun them to apply to a singular person in school, we would get told that that is wrong. It was wrong. It was grammatically wrong. The rules of grammar would say it was wrong. We have decided as a community, at least those of us who use language in this way, that that rule is no longer necessary for enforcement, and the comfort and the opportunity that using the word them as a singular pronoun is worth whatever downside grammatically might come out of that. And that's all well and good for us to use in our language today. But I don't think we have the same liberty vis-a-vis the Hebrew language as we do vis-a-vis the English language. There are people, by the way, in the Hebrew-speaking world who are wrestling with these same things and looking for new opportunities to express the idea of gender non-binary concern in Hebrew language as well. But it's just not for us to do. It's us. I think it's for us to learn from. And having said all that, translation is an art form. Translation is not a function of word in, word out, right? So, having come back to that, the reason why the statement from Rab Shmuel Bar Nachman is translated, when the eternally created Adam initially, God created him with two faces, is because it says in Hebrew, B'sha'asha bara HaKadosh Baruch Hu, at the hour in which, and I'm reading the Hebrew I have in front of me, I didn't include it in the slide today, in which the Holy One of Blessing created et Adam HaRishon, the first human being, Dio Partsufim, Baruch. It was created, right? Singular, masculine pronoun. He was created. Now we could have said to Rav Shmuel, but wait a minute. Rabbi Jeremiah just told us that this being is a plural being. And so it could have said Biyam.
Yeah.
Or it could have said, Rav Shmuel could have said God created them. But Rav Shmuel didn't. Probably because Rav Shmuel wasn't thinking the way that we're thinking, but we have to see the text as for what it says before we can interpret it for what we wish they would have said as an interpretation. So it would have been wonderful had Rav Shmuel said God created them with two faces, and we could even argue that he should have said that, but that's not what he said. So we have to encounter the text as it is. But we can choose to talk about that being in the plural, or use the word them as a singular, or use the word them to apply to that first human being, ha'adam, them, because that works for us. But if we're going to make a decision, we have to give Rav Shmuel the reshut to make the decision he's going to make in his time as well. Philip.
Particularly during the pandemic, I was live streaming from CBST in New York, which is the gay, lesbian, and trans synagogue. And they have a cantor, I guess she's a cantor, she's a cantorial student who is non-binary. And so she was doing the prayers one Friday night with the prayers like a non-binary, which sounded very strange, but it was very interesting that they actually have come up with a way to do that. When you were talking about, I guess, Hebrew speaking, meaning Israel, that they, at least this is pattern where she got it from. They got it from, sorry, I said call her she, got that from, but it was very interesting to hear.
Yeah.
Off-putting a little bit because it's not what you're used to,
Right. So Philip, you raised a lot of things in that statement, and I want to first say thank you for sharing the story, and second, credit you for the pronoun awareness that you brought to that conversation. Without knowing the pronouns of the cantor, I'm not going to presume one way or the other what he or she or they or whatever they decide to go by. I'll use they because it seems the most comfortable in this space to use. But yeah, one of the challenges that we have is that our texts are familiar to us. And the texts are familiar to us in the gendered way in which they were written in a certain time and place. And so there's a tension between familiarity, which brings comfort, which brings spirituality, and newness, which brings potential discomfort, which could bring either spirituality or perhaps take away from. I remember seeing an iteration of the priestly blessing because the priestly blessing is male. It's second person singular male. You men, you males, right? Because Hebrew has everything. So Yevarechecha, may God bless you, guy. Yevarayich, Yevarechechayich, may God bless you, female. For some reason, because it's comfortable on my lips, I have 3 daughters, and I offer them the priestly blessing in the male because it's what resonates with me. By the way, it's also grammatically correct because is it singular, is it plural? But I love the notion that you offer the blessing in the singular to a group of people so that each may feel as if they're receiving the blessing for themselves and not as part of a group. I like that side of it. Lorraine.
She used Yevarekachem, I think. Chem is the plural, isn't it?
Chem is plural masculine. Chen
okay.
is plural feminine, and
Okay.
chayich is
that's
singular feminine.
Yeah, I didn't quite get it right. Okay.
Yeah. Lorraine, I saw your hand up, and you got to unmute first so we can hear you.
Right?
Go ahead.
Rabbi, them is an objective pronoun in English. Where does the nominative pronoun they fit in?
Use it in its English form in a sentence so I know which one you're talking about. I have forgotten my cases.
It would be they.
They, like for instance, on the second line on this page I'm looking at, it says he was created as both. I know it's a different subject, but they were created.
They were created as both. Yeah. Again, right now, remember, the rabbis are struggling with the grammatical inconsistencies in the text. We're having this conversation because it doesn't make sense, because there are grammatical inconsistencies, like he was created as both genders. However, being a being with multiple genders or multiple gender identities doesn't presume that you're anything but a singular. Right? I want to throw into the mix of all of this, which is we could look at this through the lens of gender identity and say, if you have multiple gender identities, you are multiple beings. But that may actually not be the right way to do it. It may actually be that, no, you're a singular person that expresses your gender in multiple ways, which is why the notion of they, on the one hand, works, on the other hand, doesn't. Perhaps what we need is a better non-gendered singular pronoun than they, which, by the way, in German exists. German has masculine, feminine, and neuter, and it's so much less problematic because unlike other languages like Hebrew and the Romance languages where every noun is assigned one gender or the other, in German, some nouns are masculine, some nouns are feminine, and some nouns are neuter. Der, die, das. Masculine, feminine, neuter. Das Boot. Right? You've heard the movie, right? So it's less, it's grating to the ears of people to prescribe it, a neutered pronoun, to living beings. It's a way that you show disrespect. And Tammy and I are watching The Underground Railroad right now on Amazon Prime, which is a film version of the book by Colson Whitehead. And at several points throughout the film, the white slave catcher refers to the enslaved person as it, to deny her humanity. It's intentional. It's a way to degrade and deny humanity. And so it doesn't feel comfortable for us to refer to living beings, even, by the way, pets. Right? People, the dog, he or she, it's an it, up into he or she, because it's a matter of affinity. So this is all complicated and problematic because we're playing with gender and tense, and there just simply isn't enough to go around. And that, by the way, I'm going to use as the segue to the last part of the teaching. That presumes a binary nature of gender. And those same rabbis of the same generations who are struggling with this in Genesis Rabbah, even earlier rabbis in the Mishnah, are struggling with the idea that there are only two genders, or struggling with the idea that each person has only one gender, which, by the way, are not the same struggle, right? How many genders there are and how many genders an individual person can identify with are separate questions, interrelated, but they're separate. There could be 11 genders and I can only have one. There could be 11 genders and I could have 5. There could be two genders and I can, again, they operate with each other, but they're separate questions. Judy.
I'm a little confused.
Okay, good.
If God created us, them, he, she, it in his image, did God have two faces?
Well, that's a different midrash, but yes, I'm just going to answer. I'm going to answer your wondering with yes, which is to say, and I'll add more than yes to that. This is the way I like to think about that question. The awesomeness of God's capability, the awesomeness of God's being, is simply beyond us. It's what motivated someone like Maimonides to say and to offer this notion that we call negative theology. We can't talk about what God is. We can only talk about what God isn't. Because if we talk about what God is, we are limiting those characteristics of God to the depth and breadth of those characteristics as understood by the human mind. When we say that God is loving, we are only describing a fraction of the depth and breadth of God's love, because our minds can only comprehend a fraction of the depth and breadth of God's love. And the same for God's justice, and the same for God's mercy, and everything else. And so when we start getting into the question, Judy, as you started, which is what is God's gender in all of this? Does God have gender? We can't even begin, does not compute. It's beyond, right? Whatever gender expressions God has is so far beyond us that we can't even begin. But what I do know is that it's not he. That's what I do know, is that we shouldn't be talking about God as a he because it's so limiting in so many different ways. And we are also limited to the text as given to us through the generations. Whoever it was that wrote down the words of Genesis as revealed to them by God was limited by our own comprehension. And I think what we are finding here is there are some seams in that we just can't push through it. The writer of the book of Genesis and the recorder of the book of Genesis kept bumping their heads and bumping their elbows and bumping their hands on these limitations of number and person and gender as this text was written. And we see that here. Could they have been more careful? Yeah, but there's no right way to do it. They were created as a him. He was created as a them. They were created together. Like any way we do it, it doesn't encapsulate the whole thing.
Okay.
And so it's left for us to interpret. And so I think my answer to you is yes, it's all of those things. It's all of those limitations. Now, I want to introduce a word in Hebrew. Androgynos. Androgynos.
Androgynous.
Not androgynous.
No.
That's the English word. Androgynos is the word that appears in the text we have in front of us. It's the teaching from Rabbi Jeremiah. B'sha'a shebara HaKadosh Baruch Hu et ha'adam harishon. When or at the moment that God created the first human being, androginus bara'o, as both genders. Androgynos as both genders. The words that are in bold here, he was created as both genders. Androgynos, he was created. Now, unfortunately, we already have a problem, right? Because what is the pronoun to describe this character? He. He was created as both genders. Not androgynos biram, they were created as both genders, right? A better translation might be it was created as both genders, or whatever this non-gendered, non-offensive singular pronoun that we should have could be in place of the word he here. Ha'adam, right? And that's the problem with pronouns sometimes, is that they're limiting, right? They try to make it quicker. Pronouns are there so you don't say someone's name over and over and over and over again, and you can just refer to them by their chosen pronoun. He, they, she, him, whatever it may be. Pronouns are there to make language easier, but they can become an obfuscation, right? Androgynos is the word we're going to talk about. So now we're moving forward into the Mishnah. The Mishnah, as a reminder, was codified around the year 200 of the Common Era. The Mishnah was the early rabbis' first description of Jewish law that was based in Torah, that while it describes a lot of what went on in the temple, it also begins to lay the foundation of a practice of Judaism that doesn't require the temple. Mishnah 1. Androgynos, yesh bo derachim shava le'anashim, v'yesh bo derachim shava le'nashim. Androgynos is in some ways like men, and in some ways like women. V'yesh bo derachim le'anashim v'nashim, and in some ways like both men and women. V'yesh bo derachim eino shava le'anashim v'nashim, and in some ways neither like men nor women. So this person that we're going to refer to as an androgynos, and the Mishnah is suggesting that those people exist in its own time, not just in Torah time. Sometimes they're like men, sometimes they're like women, sometimes they're like both, Sometimes they're like neither. How might we describe that person today?
Androgynous.
So we might use the word androgynous, although I think that so here's why, Sue, I would push back a little bit. I mean, the etymology of the word androgynous, and by the way, it's a Greek word. I said we were teaching Greek. I was wrong, right? It's a Greek word that the rabbis, it's a Greek cognate from the Greek into Hebrew. The rabbis of the Mishnah used Greek and Latin from time to time because they were at a loss because they didn't have a word. But androgynous suggests a mixture of both male, the ANDR part, and female, the GYNO part. So a person who was both male and female, androgynous, okay, that would make sense. But I actually would suggest that this text, especially because of the last clause, androgynous isn't somehow limiting. Because if you're neither male nor female, or not typically male or typically female, then androgynous isn't the right word for you here. Because you're neither andro nor gyno, to play fast and loose with the language. This would suggest to be someone who is gender non-conforming, gender non-binary, gender queer. That's, using the language of today, yes to all of those things, right? Not to mention that if we think back to what Rabbi Micah taught us last week, we also should question, what does it mean to be like men or like women? Right? That the heteronormativity, or the cis normativity, right? Like men means they play with trucks, and like women, they play with dolls. What if you're a person who puts the doll as the driver of the truck? Brian.
Here we go.
Go
But
ahead,
we're not talking about someone who's hermaphroditic. We're not talking
What does
about
that mean to-
hermaphrodite.
What does that
Having
mean?
both male and female specific
Genitalia.
parts.
Right. So it's a great question. Are we talking about this? I think the answer is we don't know what the rabbis are talking about. Because the way that we understand this, right, and if we think back to the teaching last week from Rabbi Micah about the sex as assigned by birth,
Right.
versus gender identity, that's a distinction that we are growing accustomed to thinking about, and growing accustomed to making, and growing accustomed to responding to.
And also growing accustomed to the fact that that might be not the way to identify someone.
Correct. And that they're not that they are separate descriptors, right? So you can be biologically male at birth, you can be biologically female at birth, or you can be intersex, which is biologically possessing character traits of both the binary sexes. And your sex identity as biologically male or biologically female or intersex is not related to necessarily your gender identity. Playing with the norms of male or female or anything in between as gender. And I think that the rabbis, when they say androgynos, what's interesting is that this text, Mishnah 1 of chapter 4, is playing, I think, for the most part, with gender identity. In the way that it says they're like men and like women. However, the descriptor in Genesis Rabbah is about how they're created. This text in Genesis Rabbah, how they're created, screams to me this is about sex traits, sex identity. You're created as a male, you're created as a female, or you're created as intersex. If you think for a moment, just imagine this happening. If you have this being that God created, that had a single common backside that was split into two, the backside that only came to be after the two people were split off from one another. What sex traits, and genitalia in particular, might this two-faced being have? in its initial creation? Both. If you have a being that has the front side of a male and a front side of a female, and they are fused in the backs, they're going to have the full frontal physical sex traits of both sexes. And they are, according to Genesis Rabbah, that's the androgynos, the person that is born with both sex traits. And then Mishnah Bikurim complicates it. And by the way, if you don't agree with me that Mishnah Bikurim is talking about gender, if you think it's talking about sex, okay, because it's not clear which one it is. Except to say in the Hebrew, to me, it leans me more towards the gender because of the ways. Yesh bo derachim shave la'anashim. Ways, to me, leans me towards behaviors. Right? We talk about people being on the derech or off the derech. This is how you behave. You do these things. It's about action activity. And when I think about the difference between sex and gender, sex is not about actions. Gender is about actions. Positive identity and all those kind of things. However, it gets complicated. Mishnah 2. How is he, right? And he is problematic, and at least the translation here with the SIC suggests that the translation here is problematic because androgynous is not he, it's both. Androgynous, yesh bo drachim shav al nashim, that's the same one. How is he like men? He becomes impure when he has a seminal discharge, like men. And he dresses like men. Well, now we're continuing to mix sex and gender. He can take a wife, but he cannot be taken as a wife like men. Now we're getting into the patriarchy and the gender politics of the time as well. Because in their time, men take wives, wives don't take husbands. He must not be alone in the company of women, like other men. And he must perform the commands of the Torah like men. Right? So now we have this originally seemingly really sort of progressive and gender and sex aware character being trapped by the gender roles of the rabbinic tradition. That men do certain things and women do certain things. Men dress a certain way, men take wives, men cannot be alone with women who are of marriageable age. Men have the responsibility of time-bound positive commandments in the ways that women do not. Questions? And how is androgynous like women? Brian and Phil, you got questions?
Weren't we looking at a time when there was such a fear of homosexuality and the fear that a man may not act like a man, and if he doesn't, then he is not entitled to the privileges of a man? And really, it was a protective thing for a male identity, and a danger that we no longer feel that way. There was no right of the female to have anything. She was just property. And therefore, a man that acted like a woman was losing the ability. It was dangerous. It was really splitting a society and a danger for the society if that would be taking place. Am I wrong when I see it as being a very political type of thing?
Well, it's entirely political, which is, or at least sociological, right? I mean, these are all, right, this suggestion that, and as Rabbi Micah suggested last week, certainly gender, and perhaps to a degree even sex, are social constructs, right? I mean, the notion that men have power and women don't, that's created by this text, not because it's innate. The texts, the fact that he must perform all the commands of Torah like men, the Torah tells us what that is, right? Now, that's a whole conversation, which is why I refer to it with the patriarchy, because yes, this is a deeply patriarchal system. And so what the Mishnah is suggesting to the person who identifies as an androgynous, this is how you ought to behave. Brian, my only pushback to you is to say, just because that's the way people behaved back then, doesn't mean they were supposed to. right? But even this text encourages that if you're not sure, pick a side and go with that side. And if you have the ability to go on the man's side, you're better off. That might be true and also terrible at the same time. Philip, I saw your hand go up, and then Judy.
Excuse me. My question was, which I think is, this is probably answering it myself. The whole, you go watch Rubim and Stissel and all these things, and we familiar with how men cannot be with unmarried women. Is this where they get that from? Like if you have,
well, so it's not that this is the source. It's that this Mishnah is also responding to that teaching, right? So there's a general concern in a lot of religious cultures, including religious Judaism, that people who are of marriageable age should not be alone together. Who has seen Bridgerton? Right? If you haven't seen Bridgerton, it's fun to watch. But in Victorian England, or whatever time period that was, I forget which one, but in aristocratic English society, women and men who were not married to each other were not alone in a room together for fear of their virtue.
I get
right?
it. Yeah.
So
but it was I rang a bell when you read it. So
yes. So that's absolutely a part of the traditional approach to our tradition. And Mishnah 2 is responding it to say that if you are androgynos, you may not be alone with women.
I see.
Like a man cannot be alone with women.
Thank you. That's
okay. Judy, and then in 4 minutes we'll do 3 more texts.
Okay, it takes me back to my ketubah, where my husband had a promise A, B, C, D, and E, and I had to perform the duties incumbent upon a Jewish wife. Period.
That's the traditional way. That's the traditional model. Ketubah today, some still say that, some don't. Right? The ketubah that my wife and I have are not about what she's going to do for me and I'm going to do for her. It's about what we're going to do together. But yes, our tradition is gendered. Our tradition is patriarchal. Full stop. Okay. Which is why those of us on this call are Reform and not Orthodox. Because part of what our Reform movement is that it doesn't need to be patriarchal. We can push back against that and reframe and reconsider things like that. So how is this androgynos like women? He becomes impure when he has menstrual flow. And he must not be alone in the company of men like women. And he does not share in the inheritance of the sons like women. And like women, he is disqualified from acting as a witness. Who does the androgynos get to be alone with? Nobody.
Right.
Not men or women. It seems like they've given the androgynos the worst of both worlds. Or not. I don't know. And how is he like both men and women? Guilt is incurred for killing him or for cursing him. Okay, good. Okay. And in the case of men and women, one who unwittingly slays him must go into exile, and one who intentionally slays him must receive the death penalty. He inherits of all cases of inheritance like both men and women. It seems like this is the bare bones. You can't murder the androgynos. Is about all that they get. And there's a tension, and I have to dig deeper in terms of the inheriting in all cases of inheritance, but not inheriting like the sons. And how is he like neither men nor women? He cannot be assigned a value for the biblical tax because one amount is specified for men and for women, unlike men or women. He cannot be sold as a Hebrew slave, unlike men or women. If someone says, I will become a Nazirite, if he is neither a man nor a woman, then he becomes a Nazirite. And Rabbi Yossi says, androgynos is the creation of its own kind, and the sages should not decide if he was a man or a woman. But this is not the case of a tumtum. The tumtum is sometimes a man and sometimes a woman. Right, so the tumtum is one or the other at different time, but not both and.
Wow.
Very complicated.
Very.
Final text. Our genderqueer ancestors. This is from the Talmud, 7th, 8th centuries. Rabbi Isaac said, why were our ancestors, Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, infertile? Because the Holy One of Blessing longs to hear the prayers of the righteous. God made them not have kids, so they would pray to God to have kids. Ugh, okay, fine. Rabbi Isaac further stated, why is the prayer of the righteous compared to that of a pitchfork? As a pitchfork turns the sheaves of grain from one position to the other, so does the prayer of the righteous turn the heart of the Holy One, blessed be He, from the attribute of judgment, deen, to compassion, to rachamim. Rabbi Ami says, Abraham and Sarah were originally tumtums. For as it is said, look to the rock you were hewn from, and the hollow of the pit from you were dug. And this is to the text, look to Abraham your father, and Sarah to Sarah who bore you. Rabbi Nachman said in the name of Rabba ben Abuya, our mother Sarah was an Ilonite, for it is said, for Sarah was barren, she had no child. Which means she didn't even have a womb. There's a lot going on here. It's not entirely clear what the rabbis are trying to say. The last piece suggests that there is some biological pieces to all of this. There's almost a suggestion that Abraham did more in terms of carrying Isaac than Sarah. But I only raise this to say that this question that the rabbis struggled with gender and nonconformity even in their own time. They understood it very, very differently than we do today. But it's not like these are new ideas. And that I think is really, really important because one of the pieces, and I'll end with this, of our reform movement is the notion that we are not asking questions that were never asked before. We just feel differently able to empower them than other Jews of today. Other Jews of today said these questions were asked and answered, and those answers stand for all time. And we say they were asked in the generation before, and they were asked in the generation before that, and we are asking them in our generation, and there are those who will ask them in the generation after us. And we owe it to ourselves and to humanity and to the Holy One of Blessing to ask the question and to answer them to the best of our wisdom and our insights in our own time, and not rely only on the wisdom and insights of times before us.
Wow.
Okay.
And a big credit to the team at Keshet for putting these texts together and allow them to have us to use them in our teachings today. Next week, we will be visited by Robin Schwartz from Equality Florida, who I'm sure will have a lot to talk about what's going on in terms of the policy and legal fight around LGBTQ plus issues of public policy. I will just give a little feeder, which is that if you haven't heard, in the last 24 hours, the Secretary of Education came out to say specifically that transgender girls should be allowed to compete with other girls in interscholastic sports, including at the high school level, which is exactly what the law that was signed a week ago said isn't allowable. I'm expecting there to be some kind of confrontation between the state and the federal government around that at some point in the future, and I'm sure Robin will speak to that as well. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.